Hi there. My name is Joshua Eastman. I'm a student at Princeton University, class of 2022, majoring in environmental engineering. Today, it is my pleasure to interview Mr. Bill McKibben, environmentalist, author, journalist, and founder of the climate group 350.org. In addition to being a frequent contributor to publications such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, the New Yorker, and National Geographic, Mr. McKibben has published a number of groundbreaking books on climate change and was on the front line against the proposed Canadian U.S. Keystone pipeline project and the People's Climate March. Mr. McKibben is also a lifelong Methodist and will be speaking to how Christian scripture and thinking speaks to his thinking regarding the climate crisis.
Pleasure to be with you.
I'd like to start with the question, what resources are found in Christian tradition that speak to humanity's place within creation?
They're right from the very beginning. I mean, if you read the very first page of the Bible, what is it but an account of creating every living thing around us and a commandment to take care of it? That's the first job that God gave people, and it's probably the one we've done the worst at. In the we're the bad babysitters who, given charge of the world, have tattooed it and pierced it and did every other thing we could think of to it. So we're not doing too well. There are many other, of course, um, powerful scriptural references to draw on. I wrote a book once about the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, which is God's longest speech in the Bible, Old Testament or New, where God explains that we're a small part of something very big and buzzing and mysterious and beautiful and cruel and glorious, and for Job, that's enough. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable part of the Bible. Maybe my most favorite part of the Old Testament. And then, of course, the Gospels are filled with the command to love one's neighbor, which is precisely the opposite of what we're doing now. By raising the temperature of the earth, we're drowning our neighbors, we're making them sick, we're making it impossible for them to raise food, we're forcing them to leave their homes. We're told to act on behalf of the least of these, but in fact, climate change is just the opposite. The iron law of climate change is those who have done the least to cause it suffer the most and fastest. So there are deep resources within our faith tradition that should be calling us to act on this deepest problem that humans have ever faced.
You mentioned how relating to humanity and creation can be more than just intellectual. It can be spiritual and somewhat of a mystery. How can people engage in the more spiritual aspects of creation and humanity's place in it?
I think most human beings have long realized that, um, along with being in church, being outdoors in beautiful places is a deep way to connect with God. Um, Anybody who's ever walked through a giant forest or sat on the beach at sunset or been in the high mountains has a strong sense of the glory of creation. Anyone who's watched animals or seen human communities understands just how important it is to protect the thing that allows us all to keep doing what we do.
Do you have stories of Christian communities that are getting the relationship between humanity and the environment right?
Absolutely. I do a lot of work on trying to stop various bad projects of the fossil fuel industry and trying to convince people to stop their financial support of the fossil fuel industry. And we've seen enormous action by communities of faith along these lines. You know, when I was first rounding people up to go to jail at the start of the fight against the Keystone pipeline almost a decade ago, that was the first big of these fights. Um, um, it was all sorts of uh, ministers and nuns and other people of faith that were responding to the fight. And that was long before the leaders of many of those traditions joined in. Now it's a little easier because, the Pope has said this is a key part of the battle, and all the religious denominations who joined in. And so more and more we see that happening. That's why it's so important that so many faith communities have decided to divest their financial holdings from fossil fuels. And we've watched this play out in one diocese after another, in one denomination after another, the Lutherans, the United Church of Christ, the Episcopalians, so on and so forth. And we've seen it in the great colleges of the religious tradition, Georgetown, the preeminent Catholic institution in the U.S. just this year, for instance. So those have been really, really powerful witnesses that really matter from people of faith.
With the upcoming election in mind, have any of these groups engaged in environmental activities as an election issue?
We're in an even numbered year in the US, which means it's an election. And that means that the most leverage we have for the next few months will be in the course of that election. And this election is a particularly important one, particularly around climate change. It was our president, Mr. Trump, who withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. That is, the country that has poured more carbon into the atmosphere than any other country is also the only country in the world that's not participating in the global effort to solve this problem. That should make us ashamed. That should make us tremble in shame. And so it is absolutely imperative that we see a change in November. It's also true that politics doesn't stop on election day, and that November 4th will be important too, and November 5th and November 6th. The point of elections, it seems to me, is not to elect saviors and messiahs. Those are few and far between. It's to elect people that you can then pressure to do the right thing. And, you can pressure Joe Biden to get something done. You can't pressure Donald Trump. Doesn't make any difference. We could all march on Washington till the end of time. And as long as he's in power, he won't do a darn thing. So that's why this election is so important.
Speaking about the crisis we find ourselves in at this moment, COVID has changed our relationship with many things, including the environment. Less driving, less meat consumption, less air and water pollution. How do you think this present moment can teach us theological lessons regarding our place in the earth?
So it's been the COVID spring has been such an interesting time, a great tragedy, and there are no silver linings to a tragedy, but there are lessons to be learned. And one of the most interesting is, as you point out, we've changed our lifestyles in enormous ways we would have thought impossible even a year ago if someone had suggested. I don't know anyone who's been on an airplane for many months, for instance. And what's good is that that's cut emissions, 10% or something, demonstrating that really people can change. And we've all learned, like most of us don't need to drive an hour to work every day. We can do an awful lot of it in other ways. So that's good. The trouble is that it only cut emissions 10%, which leads us to conclude, I think, that most of the problem is hardwired into the systems around us. And we're going to have to rip the coal and gas and oil out of those systems and replace them with insulation and sun and wind. And that's going to take a big fight to do because the fossil fuel industry doesn't want it to happen. And it's a very politically powerful and rich industry. And people have to be willing to stand up to it and break its political power. It is what the good book was referring to, I think, in our time when it talked about principalities and powers. And that's, what Exxon and Chevron and people are. And that's why it's so important that we do things like divestment so we can break their political power and get change on a scale that addresses the root of the problem.
You've talked about divestment, and I'm wondering what are some other practical steps that Christians can take in terms of advocating more environmental protection within their church and local communities?
They can get involved in the environmental justice fights, which are often right around coal-fired power plants and pipelines and things. We put all the worst stuff in the world right in the neighborhoods of the poorest people and people of color around the country. And so, exactly the same communities that have to deal with police brutality all the time also have to deal with having coal-fired power plant down the street and particulates in their lungs. I can't breathe can come from a lot of different places. You know, Black Americans have 3 times the asthma rate of white Americans. So there can be a policeman kneeling on your neck, and it also can be a dirty power plant down the street. So those are good places to act, I think.
As we wrap up our interview here, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think that just the thing to bear in mind is this is the biggest fight that humans have ever been in. It's unlike in its scale anything that's happened during the course of our species. And what we do over the next 10 or 20 years will determine what life is like for people and for all the rest of creation for many, many thousands of years to come. So that's a burden to have to deal with that, but it's also in a certain way a privilege and an honor to get to be involved in a fight that can help people for thousands of years to come if we do what we need to do right now.
Thank you so much for being a part of this LECTION project and for sharing your wisdom with us, Mr. McKibben.